Welcome to Scoop and Scale, where we dish up the science and weigh the facts about mostly equine nutrition. I'm Jill Jackson, lifelong equestrian, podcast producer, and pony owner. I'm a dressage rider and at-home horse keeper, living the challenge of managing easy keepers on multiple acres of pasture.
And I'm equine nutrition consultant, Dr. Claire Tunis of Clarity Equine Nutrition. I develop diet plans for horses ranging from metabolic seniors to Olympic athletes. I also consult for equine nutrition companies. I'm a scientist, dressage rider, and pony club mom.
Claire and I have been horse friends for almost 20 years, and like all good horse friends, we're always talking horses. We talk about the challenges of managing our horses, our riding struggles, feeding horses, and what's going on in the wider equine community. This podcast is a place for us to have conversations mostly about equine nutrition. It's for anyone who wants to make better choices when it comes to feeding their horses.
And before we get started, a quick disclaimer. The information in this podcast is general and not meant to replace the individualized advice of your own qualified equine nutritionist or veterinarian. And while I have a PhD in nutrition, I'm not a veterinarian and can't give medical advice.
With that, thank you for joining us, and we hope you enjoy the following episode.
Every year, and with seemingly increased frequency, I work with horse owners that are pulling their hair out because their horse is passing brown liquid either before or after manure. They've tried fixing it with off-the-shelf probiotics, typically with no effect. They've consulted their vet, who often can find nothing obviously wrong, and the horse seems generally happy and healthy, but the manure water down the hind legs is attracting flies and requires endless cleaning, sometimes leading to chapped skin. The owners have had enough. They know something isn't right, but they don't know what to do about it. And the most frustrating part may be that just as they get it cleared up and finally let out a sigh of relief, it comes back.
Free Fecal Water Syndrome is a condition that our listeners have asked us to cover, and as someone that owns a paint pony with pink skin that gets loose manure and poop down his legs, I totally get it. To help us better understand what this condition is and how it is diagnosed and how to treat it, we are happy to welcome back Dr. Phoebe Smith. Dr. Smith, welcome back.
Thank you. Good to be here.
The last time you joined us, we talked at length about gastric ulcers. As an internal medicine specialist, you specialize in all inner workings of the horse. Could you briefly remind our listeners what makes an internist different than the regular veterinarian?
Sure. So an internal medicine specialist has gone through additional training post-vet school, an internship, and minimum 3-year residency training focused in anatomy, physiology, and internal medicine of sort of a wide array of diseases. And so our focus, I usually describe as very deep, somewhat narrow, in that it's internal medicine. Don't ask me to pinch a twin or, block a pastern or anything like that. But it does allow very deep understanding and knowledge of specific internal medicine conditions.
So as we kind of move into our discussion about free fecal water syndrome, I think we should probably set the stage, and perhaps you could help us by explaining to listeners, how would they know their horse is dealing with free fecal water syndrome? What does this actually look like?
Your description initially was actually pretty good. It's that it's usually there is a portion of the manure that is either formed fecal balls or soft formed fecal balls, and there are a lot of very creative descriptions that unfortunately often relate to food. But free fecal water syndrome is a portion of the manure is passed as formed or soft formed fecal balls. And then there is a liquid portion that's passed either before, during, so sort of around the passage of formed fecal balls, or after. And that's distinguishes it from other GI disturbances.
So is this the same as diarrhea, loose stool?
It's sort of separating out, I guess. It actually is a bit of a different syndrome. I think loose stool, is fairly subjective, but we think of the entire consistency of the manure passed as being loose. So maybe, beyond soft formed into a loose category. And diarrhea we usually think of as very loose or watery. And that's, again, the entire contents of the manure is that substance. And so that's how we quite practically distinguish it from this, what we're talking about today, the fecal free water syndrome.
So horses are supposed to absorb a lot of water out of their digestive tract right at the very end to make manure. I mean, everything's kind of a slurry until you get to the very end and you reabsorb all that water and you make those fecal balls. So it's a bit of an odd thing to me that horses with fecal water syndrome can make fairly normal manure, but somehow also be passing water before or after it. So what's actually going on there physically that results in fecal water? Do we actually know?
We don't actually know. And you're absolutely right that the sheer volume of water that the horse's colon manages is really pretty remarkable. And there's some interesting work that shows that the water content of all parts of manure that's passed in horses with free fecal water syndrome is really not distinctly different from horses with normal manure. And so it's more about the water is not sort of incorporated into those fecal balls normally. People, rightly so, are often concerned about, is my horse going to get dehydrated? He, has this syndrome and we're heading into the heat of summer. Is this going to be a problem? And that's actually not something we see. But there are a lot of things that we don't know about this syndrome. There is a fair bit of focus on it currently.
Well, that's good.
Right.
Yeah.
It sounds like there could be multiple causes for free fecal water syndrome. What seems to be some of the more common ones that you've seen?
I will say, I'll back up just a little bit and say it often requires really spending some time with the horse owner, the barn, in trying to go back in time to understand when it started, right? Because it's not a life-threatening or a critically severe condition, oftentimes a veterinarian is not involved immediately. And people have tried things, and fairly so. But by the time I get involved, typically we really have to really work to go back and say, okay, when do we think this started? And then ask a series of questions that really helps. Oftentimes, I will say that there's not a firm answer on that. That it's a little bit unclear. Sometimes it is clear. And in the cases where there's a clear answer, like, no, it began, at this situation. It can be there was a new batch of hay or was delivered to the barn, a different type of hay began to be fed. We moved, the horse moved locations. So introduction of new, typically hay, I hear it less frequently as relates to a new concentrate. And then seasonality is a big one that I hear, at least in California, that, my horse does this more often than not, it's winter, late fall to winter, and whether it began and remained or began and resolves as spring and summer come around and then comes back again. That's a pretty frequent story when late fall or winter come.
I hear that too. I have people that come to me and their horses have this, and they say, "Oh, it comes and goes with the weather changes." Especially big swings in weather changes or whatever. So which ties into that seasonality that you're talking about.
And I think one of the important things to distinguish in that is to understand is what management and feed practices might accompany changes in weather. Maybe none, but oftentimes some, right? Maybe the horses don't go out on pasture if it's cold and raining. Maybe they are fed a different type of hay if they're not outside than they are when they are outside. Those are the types of differences that I find I need to sort of drill down. A lot of times, to find out when is there an inciting cause? Is there something we can pinpoint and say, okay? And then also to try to determine, is there something that we know isn't working for this horse, to sort of narrow our strategies moving forward.
Yeah. I know a good number of horses with this issue who seem to be older, senior horses. I don't know if that's something that you see this too. Are there other demographics of horses that seem to get this more commonly?
I do see it slightly more frequently in older, and by older, I would say, late teens and up might be, but also, somewhat regularly in younger horses. I don't typically see it in the 2-year-olds, in that,
Right.
Without some factor like sand accumulation. Young horses are a little bit more likely to eat things they shouldn't.
Right.
Right. And so that sort of middle-aged group definitely exists as well.
Mm-hmm.
I've read that there's studies that were done that identified geldings as more likely to have free fecal than mares. Do you find that to be true?
So I do see it more often in geldings, but I guess because I also know that the population of horses I see it's slightly skewed with more geldings than mares, and so I think if we really want to make sense of that piece, we'd probably need to do that math as well, right?
That's a fair point, right? Yeah,
true.
There are a lot
of geldings,
performance horse geldings. Yeah,
yes, exactly. And so I do see it in mares, but more commonly in geldings.
I've also read that it's more common in gray and paints than it is in other colors. Do you think that's true, or have you seen that?
I'm having to think about that. I've seen it in every color.
I'd have to think you just see it more easily on a gray and paint horse. I mean, I would have
more
to really
irritating, maybe,
and I think I would have I own a dark bay black type horse, and I mean, I would notice it because I'm pretty diligent about grooming and whatever. But I could see how if you don't really go over your horse with a fine tooth comb every day, you might miss it from a distance. Like let's say you had a bunch of horses eating off a round bale out in pasture, and you're just sort of looking at them over the gate. You might not see it on a black horse, but you would probably notice it in the tail of your gray or paint horse or whatever. So maybe it seems more prevalent in those. I don't know. That's an interesting.
And I think that, Jill, I think that came from a study that basically was built on owner survey. Does that sound right?
I know that I think it was in the Netherlands that they had seen that, and I'd have to go back and try and reference it again to find it.
Yes, I'm familiar with that one, and it was owner survey. So it does, bring to question, is that real, or is that a factor of, the human, it would bother you much more. And it does bother people when their gray horse and their tail is nasty and their whole back end is nasty. Or
Jill and I
Jill's little paint horse.
With
as
a white
somebody
tail,
that has a paint, that is a gelding, that has had free fecal water syndrome.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would say that those numbers, those statistics are correct.
Yeah,
and
your horse did that.
Yeah. We've had so many conversations about how do I make this white tail white again?
Oh, that's a whole nother podcast, isn't it?
Yes, the things that really work to make tails white. And he's got this beautiful big Welsh, type tail.
Oh, really?
A lot of tail.
Oh, do you keep it in a tail bag or something to try to?
We currently do not have free fecal water syndrome, but we had it for about, I think it was maybe 6 months or so when we first moved here. And so at that point it was, no, I didn't do anything. I just kept trying to clean it and, did what everybody else does to try to maintain it, and chapped skin and anyway, so.
Yeah. But that was a classic case of you move from Colorado and kind of a dry, no pasture type environment, right, to Iowa and pasture and grazing. So it speaks exactly to what Phoebe was saying earlier about moving the horse and changes in management. And it was exactly that.
Right.
It's been gone for how long, Jill? The fecal water?
Almost 2 years.
Oh, great.
Yeah.
Great. I was worried that like, 2 months. Oh, is it going to be a seasonal one? But 2 years, awesome.
No, every time I see a drip like on his hocks or anything, I'm like, it's coming back. Please don't come back. But so far, we have other issues besides that. We've moved on to bigger issues than that.
Least of your worries.
That seems like such a cute issue at this point. But anyway.
It sure does.
That's a whole different topic with respiratory asthma, dealing with asthma, Jill is now. But anyway, it's interesting to me. I remember years ago going into a barn in Northern California, and they had changed their hay quite rapidly, sort of talking to what you had mentioned earlier. And they kind of got me in. I would say the majority of horses had some reaction to the hay, some sort of loose manure, stocking up, a little bit of gas, you name it. Something had happened to most of them, and we were like several weeks out from that at this point, and most of them had gone back to normal. But it was interesting because there were just these sort of 2 or 3 horses out of, say, 40. It was a pretty big barn that still had loose manure and all the free fecal water, and it had really sort of messed them up, and they had not gone back to normal. And it's interesting to me that I do see that in barns when it seems to have been triggered by a hay change or forage change, that after a week, 10 days, the majority of horses just sort of sort themselves out and their equilibrium kind of goes back to normal. But you'll get these like 1 or 2 where it's just like really thrown them for a loop. And I've always wondered like what that is about those 1 or 2 horses. Do you think it's just natural variation, or that those horses maybe don't have such a robust microbiome, or maybe there's got other gut GI things going on and this is like the icing on the cake, or
Right. All of those questions I have too, in addition to, are those horses, that type of hay doesn't agree with them.
Right. That's a good point.
Because sometimes in those cases, we switch to a different hay type, sort of within, maybe within the grass hay family. And we say, well, okay, they're not digging this beautiful, wonderful Timothy you switched to. Let's switch to orchard. I know it seems too similar to work, but sometimes it absolutely does. So we don't actually know. There's not any work that's just, unearthed the answer to that question. What is it that makes those couple of horses? And I see the same scenario, that a couple that really just, so I don't know. Are they just sensitive? Do they have a less robust microbiome? Interestingly, there is work that shows no difference in the gut microbiome of horses with this fecal water syndrome and normal horses.
That's
statistically different. Right. But there's a lot of variation in the gut microbiome, right? And it's more likely to be similar in horses living together on the same property. That's probably not surprising to anyone. Anyway, I thought that was a really, really interesting study, because it's easy to say, the little gut bacteria, which are super important to horse, digestion, are out of whack, right? The quote unquote bad bacteria have increased in numbers and the good bacteria have diminished, and it makes a lot of sense. Well, some somewhat recent work has shown that doesn't appear to be the case. So we can't just blame. Yes, the microbiome.
That's interesting. Yeah, because
right?
you would just assume that was the answer.
Well, that's kind of been what it's been our sort of like, this is probably it, and that's sort of where the work is right now in this area, is trying things that like, okay, seems like this, so let's test that theory, and we're almost ruling out causes, which hopefully will lead to narrowing down the problem a little bit, but rather than, we haven't landed on like, aha, here's what the cause is. And perhaps it's not the same cause in all horses. That's sort of what I suspect, because it presents at different times, because the onset is different, because the fix is so different.
Right.
I suspect this is going to be a more broad umbrella, and in time we'll sort of tease out different subsets of types.
Yeah, I would tend to agree with that. That's what I kind of see too. We're sort of jumping we'll talk about this in a little bit, but like I feel like I have like a toolkit of like handful of things I'll try. And I always tell owners, like, we're going to try this. And if it doesn't work, that's fine, because it tells us it's not that. So then we're going to try this over here and we'll try that, kind of thing. And it's a process, I don't, they are all different. And so I don't feel like I have one magic bullet that's going to definitely do it.
Right. We'd all be doing that. If one thing worked, right. I mean, exactly. We'd all be doing the same thing and somebody would be a billionaire, right?
Yeah, we'll just keep trying, kind of figure it out. No, but it doesn't seem to work that way.
So if I'm a horse owner and I notice that my horse has fecal water, do I call my vet first, or do I wait and see if it goes away on its own? And if so, like, how long should I be waiting before I get the vet out?
So that's a great question. I would say to contact your veterinarian if you're not sure if it represents fecal water or diarrhea. If it's one of those like, this isn't totally clear, this is an in-between sort of situation. Worth, take some pictures. We have so many poop pictures, that we receive. That's not offensive to a large animal veterinarian. And additionally, if your horse is not feeling well, so they're off their feet a little, they're a little dumpy, maybe not even overtly colicky, but just laying down more, sort of, maybe some subtle colic signs, that would be, yes, call your vet right away. If it's just your horse is bright-eyed and bushy-tailed and just started having a little bit, I don't mind, give it a week. Easy, give it a week, 10 days. If there was something in the particular bit of hay the horse had or in pasture and it resolves, that's fine with me. If many horses in the barn suddenly develop it, I think it would be worth getting a veterinarian involved to understand what's going on. But I don't have a problem anyway with giving it a little bit of time if the horse is otherwise feeling great.
If I do get my vet out, how's the vet most likely going to work up that horse?
I am betting that varies as well. I can tell you my approach is based on wanting to rule out any underlying causes that I can identify. And so obviously a physical exam and listening for sand, a history is probably what I spend a ton of time on. Like we talked about, really understanding, when it began and what triggers and all the feeds and any other horses involved, et cetera. So for me, history, physical exam, blood work, I don't want to miss something that's right under my nose, because there are other causes of GI disturbance, and so I don't want to miss something easy. In many cases, this is the internal medicine approach. I do an abdominal ultrasound. I want to understand if we have any thickening of small or large bowel walls, any excess free fluid. That's an important piece of it for me, because we do occasionally see horses with bowel disease that actually begins sort of up front, if you will, and extends all the way back. More often, those will result in loose manure or diarrhea, but occasionally fecal water syndrome. But there definitely are GI conditions that are not relegated to just one segment. So the colon we think of, right, the sort of back end of the GI tract with fecal water syndrome. But there are conditions that involve all parts. So that's why I do the abdominal ultrasound. That is the majority of cases, sort of the extent of diagnostics.
Do you see sand, causing fecal water, or does that tend to cause more actual loose manure and diarrhea?
That's more likely to cause loose manure.
Okay.
Yes. I don't often find sand. I mean, where I am in California, listening to the ventral abdomen with the stethoscope is part of a physical exam.
Right. We do that here too. Yeah.
Right.
So,
I'm sure.
Yeah.
Right. Like that's like and so you find it even in something you're seeing for not a GI problem. You want to identify it if it's there, right? And let the owner know that, we have an issue. I did want to say one thing about when to call your veterinarian. So I said that, if everything is great, leaving them a handful of, a week, 10 days, great, maybe it all resolves. But I will say the cases that I've had the least success in helping have been the most chronic. So we can theorize lots of things about that, why that would be. But in other words, the horse who's had fecal water for years, multiple years, is harder for me to help. That is something I've found versus the horse that, maybe more on the order of weeks to months. I have had better success in helping those.
I would actually agree. Actually, the things that I tend to try for those are similar. And it's, when they come to me and they're like, he's been doing this for, how long has it been? Like 2 years. And I just sort of go, oh, I don't, and especially also normally because at that point they've tried so many things as well already, and so I'm sort of sitting there thinking, I'm not quite sure what I'm going to suggest to you that you haven't already tried. Let's be honest, you've tried a lot of things, although sometimes people haven't stuck with things long enough for them to really take effect. So sometimes that is and then also it's hard. I find it's hard to actually get an accurate history at that point because people don't remember what they've tried, which is totally fine. I don't remember what I did 2 years ago.
Right.
It's
exactly.
What really happened when this started? Oh, I don't really remember. And how long did how long did you give that for? Well, I don't know, maybe a month, or maybe it was a couple. It's like, and it's hard then to be.
I was just going to say, something that definitely for people that are listening, if your horse has this or starts to get it, get a little notebook, keep it with your grooming kit, and start writing down, because there isn't a quick fix and you're going to have to try so many things. And I hope the first thing works for you. It didn't work for me, but you're going to start, after 6 months, you stop remembering what you did and when you did it. So putting the date and what you're starting and then making sure you're doing it long enough so that you can actually see that change. Because like you said, it's trial and error to figure out what is going to work and what's not going to work. So if you're just getting into this, keep a notebook, write the date, write what your change is going to be. And then when you get to the next thing, if you have to try the next thing, write that down also. You will lose track.
That's a fantastic point, Jill. I'm glad you brought that up. I think it's and people can use, notes on their phone.
Yeah.
I've had people make spreadsheets. I got to say, I'm pretty delighted when somebody sort of sheepishly says, I made a spreadsheet. I'm like, ooh, I like the sound of that.
Data.
Send that over. It is super helpful. And it's impossible because sometimes there's a little improvement, right? And then it goes back, and remembering how many days after the introduction of X that occurred.
Right.
So great point.
Things like, like we talked about, you've suddenly, it's back. Well, what's the weather like today? And if it comes back multiple times, you start to realize, it always comes back when like the barometric pressure drops or whatever. And we suddenly, storm rolls in and the weather gets cold and it's very unsettled weather or whatever. And you can start to see a pattern. But if you don't write it down, you don't see the pattern. Or like, for example, in Jill's case, where you're turning out on pasture, like, does it always happen when you turn out first thing in the morning? Or maybe it happens when you turn out after lunch in the afternoon, because then you start to be able to say, is it because there's more sugar in the grass in the afternoon or whatever? And you, again, start to see these patterns. But if you haven't written this stuff down, it's very hard to really see the patterns and identify them and then be able to make, different management decisions that might actually have an effect.
And it can be a really long road. When you first start it, you think, okay, maybe 2 weeks, this is going to be done. But when you're 4 months in, it's hard to remember all the different things that you've tried and when you did them.
Mm-hmm, for sure.
It's another great point, and one that I often try to make when I begin working with a horse and owner with this is we have to be patient. And the other thing, I think, we're all a little impatient, myself included. And what I try to get across is I'm going to, leave you today, but we're not done. Right. I don't want, I never want people to feel like, I can't update her. That'll be, I don't want to bother the vet. Right. It's an ongoing process. So I usually try to schedule okay, in 2 weeks, please update me. So, we sort of establish a schedule based on that particular horse and what's going on and what the plan is, regularly scheduled updates that I ask the owner to email me with okay, at this stage of the game, email me. And to your point, Jill, it's probably going to mean trying different things. And I don't want people to get frustrated with my vet doesn't know what's going on because it didn't work. It's very much a trial and error, and it is a commitment to sort of work together toward that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
It's so very, very frustrating. So again, sorry for anybody that has to go through this, but
yes,
just
I think it's frustrating.
Stick to path.
It's frustrating for the veterinarian as well, right?
Sure.
Because you would love to just be able to hand the solution over, and it just often isn't that way. And it is that, it is this trial and error. So again, as you say, Phoebe, it's not a reflection on your vet not knowing or what have you. No. And it's equally as frustrating. No. Better believe your vet would love to hand you the solution and be able to be like, that's it, done, fixed, moving on.
Right. Happy horse, happy client.
Right. Nobody likes the kind of like, oh gosh, here we are 6 months in and nothing much has changed, right? I mean, nobody loves that. So, So I've had, we kind of touched on it briefly, hinted at it, but I've had quite a lot of luck when I have these horses that come to me for thinking that they need nutrition help by changing either the form or the type of forage that they're consuming. So, sometimes, like you said, that's a switch from, say, Timothy to Orchard, or sometimes it's even just switching from Timothy hay to some amount of Timothy pellets in the diet. So what are some of your, approaches for these horses? You did mention about forage. What do you find sometimes works?
So many different things. I would say there's one that is probably a more clear pattern that you can discern as relates to pasture. I actually see horses who get fecal water when they're not on pasture. So when they're, whether it's seasonal or more often, they're pulled in off of that in wintertime and kept off of the pasture. And so that's definitely something that if we can, have a pasture that horse can continue to go on, that's sort of an easy one. And then just as you said, the type or the form of hay. And I often do a fair bit of talking with the owner to determine which of those is going to be a better choice for the horse based on history, for the barn, for a lot of reasons. In terms of which one of these where should we start? We have this list of things we're going to try. And I usually have an opinion about which one I think we should start with, but also it has to be they have to be able to do it. It has to be sustainable. And of course, we need to come to an agreement. This is very much a group project, right? This is owner, barn, myself. We're all working on it together. So we all need to be in agreement that yes, we're going to start here. And so sometimes it is changing hay type. Very often, I use a lot of pellets for these, and a proportion of the diet that is changed from hay to hay pellet varies. One of the things I try to do, particularly when there's a lot of frustration, is sort of go clean, if you will, on the diet. Like for a short period of time, let's remove all 92 of these supplements. So we can add them in sort of one by one once we get this under control.
Right.
But I basically try to have limited ingredients going into the horse. That's sort of my thought. So we can understand what's going on. So eliminating supplements again for a period of time, for a trial. I don't mean forever necessarily, but maybe some of them. And then the proportion of pellets will vary based on severity and what I might see on ultrasound, et cetera. And I don't like to remove long stem hay from horses, for all the reasons from our last podcast on gastric ulcers. So we have to be strategic about then how we spread that long stem hay out through the day, et cetera. But I would say that for me is probably, of the things that we use to manage this, it's probably the single most effective that I have is utilizing pellets. So, very, very short. Can you use cubes? Yes. A complete pelleted feed, yes. The thing with a complete pelleted feed, say a senior, for example, is there are a lot of ingredients in it. And one of my tenets is let's simplify the number of ingredients.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So what about beet pulp? Do you ever have any luck with beet pulp? I mean, it's interesting. I've definitely, heard people feel that beet pulp can be very beneficial for the hindgut because it is sort of a readily fermentable, easy to digest type fiber. I will say I did have a client at one point that we added beet pulp, and actually she had senior. To your point about simplifying the diet, she was doing a senior that had beet pulp in it, and we increased the amount of senior and decreased the hay because the horse was already getting senior, and that was what she wanted to do versus doing pellets. And it actually got worse. And ultimately, she figured out that beet pulp didn't work for her horse, and taking out anything with loose beet pulp actually didn't help. But I'm just curious, do you have any luck with beet pulp?
Occasionally, and it does make a lot of sense, right? Beet pulp is healthy for the colon. It promotes the production of butyrate, and really is, I suppose, in some ways, a prebiotic of sorts.
Right.
And I like beet pulp as a general. I use it a lot, particularly in horses who need a healthy way to add calories, etc. I have been maybe it's my turn to have some good luck with beet pulp, but I've had less luck with beet pulp than I would have liked in terms of resolving fecal water. I do have some colleagues who have had better luck with it, so that's sort of curious, right? Is it regional? Right? Is it,
is it
what
the
is
quality
the case
of the
selection?
beet pulp? Yeah.
Right. Because some respected colleagues have had better luck with it. So I should keep trying it and see if maybe I'll hit a run of luck, because that's a pretty easy thing, right?
Right.
And we used to think we had to soak beet pulp for hours and hours and hours, right, before we fed it. And which kind of diminished the, attractiveness of that as a feed,
adds management
quite honestly.
hassle. Right.
Yeah, and in the hot summer, these bowls of, soggy beet pulp sitting around and flies getting on them. And we've since learned we don't have to soak beet pulp. It is certainly a viable option, and one that I would absolutely, use. It's easy, it's inexpensive, it is a good quality feed for the colon. What about you, Claire? Are you seeing much?
I don't do a lot of similar reasons. I don't do a lot with straight beet pulp. I do a little bit. I haven't really tried it that much for fecal water, I have to be honest. So I haven't tried it that much. And I generally always, if I do recommend people use beet pulp, it's nearly always the shreds.
Yes.
Non-molasses
shreds.
Non-molasses shreds.
Right.
There are some really nice, sort of premium shreds out on the market that are very clean. There are other beet pulp shreds. You open the bag and you're like, wow, look at these sticks and things in here. So there's definitely varying qualities of beet pulp. The unmolasses shreds, to your point, I don't, those I don't worry about soaking. The pellets can be like bullets. And so those, but they all,
yes.
but those I don't do a lot with pellets, to be honest. But I haven't tried it a lot with fecal water syndrome, so I'll have to give it a whirl the next time I have a client and see if they're up for it. And I mean, I will, I'll add some water to it. But to your point, you don't have to. You don't have to soak it. I always tell people, honestly, if you want to add water to it, why wouldn't you, right? Just to get more water in the digestive tract. But to your point, it doesn't have to be soaked. I remember as a child soaking it for like overnight, hours and hours and hours.
That's what we used to say. Yes, there were these weird buckets of stuff sitting around.
I know, and it just doesn't take. And if you want to add water to it, literally 20 minutes, it's like the shreds are fluffed up. They're fine.
They have done what they can do. Right there.
And people always say to me, it's like, you can feed it dry. And I'm always like,
you can.
You look at all the, feeds out there that have shredded beet pulp loose in them, and nowhere on the bag does it say must be soaked before feeding. You know what I mean? So I know we're going to create a scandal here by saying we don't need to soak beet pulp. But
I wonder if you might, Claire, I still run into a lot. People are concerned about beet pulp and the sugar content.
Right.
Just
Yeah.
not being super, aware of which portion of the beet pulp it is.
Right.
I wonder if you might
It's
just mention
a
that.
valid concern because it's called sugar beet pulp, right? And we grow
Right.
it for sugar. And so
Right.
I get why people think it has a lot of sugar in it, but what we feed to horses is what's left over after the sugar's been removed. So my sister-in-law and mother-in-law live in Idaho. Idaho is a really big beet pulp producing state, and so whenever we go visit them, we drive past this beet pulp processing plant. So I always think about, like when you see it, like they're extracting all the sugar from those beets, and what's left is the leftover fiber and very little sugar. It's actually a very low NSC, low sugar feed. It's actually a great option for horses that need more calories who are insulin dysregulated, as long as they haven't added molasses to it. And sometimes they do add molasses to it because it's sort of an anemic. If you buy just straight plain beet pulp and look at it, it shreds. They're kind of anemic looking. They're kind of these weird, grayish sort of. They don't look very appetizing. Bland, not very appetizing. Yeah, exactly. Just kind of And so obviously, if you put molasses on them, that makes them all kind of black and shiny and attractive looking. But then you've completely, now they've got lots of sugar in them. So that's not, that's not what I don't think I've ever recommended beet pulp with molasses on. Especially not for any of this. So if you do have a horse that has metabolic issues and you're really trying to stay away from sugar, make sure the beet pulp you have doesn't have added molasses. But otherwise, it's a great option for all horses, including those that have issues with insulin dysregulation and metabolic problems. But it is a great source of fermentable fiber. There's more calories in beet pulp per pound than hay, so that's something you have to be a little aware of. A pound of beet pulp. It's maybe 25% more calories than a pound of hay. So it's not a one-to-one substitution. You're going to end up feeding a little bit less. And I think that there was some research showing a number of years ago now where they fed, I think, up to 50% of the horse's forage intake as beet pulp. So you can actually use it to replace quite a lot of hay. So for this type of situation where you have free fecal water and you're trying to cut down on the amount of long stem forage that might be, for whatever reason, causing irritation or whatever the cause is for the fecal water syndrome, you can use beet pulp to replace a good amount of that hay if you don't do hay pellets or something instead. It's good stuff.
So psyllium is another form of fiber I see some trying, but it's quite expensive and maybe not as easy to use because it turns into jelly. So if you have to have wet food, it's kind of gross. Is there any data to support psyllium for use for treatment in free fecal water?
I don't know that there's any data to support it. There is science to support it in that it functions also as a prebiotic, meaning it provides nutrients to the colonic cells rather than a probiotic, which is providing bacteria. And so psyllium does promote colonic health and, again, promotes butyrate production, which definitely is helpful for those little colon cells to be in primary health. I use psyllium probably more frequently in diarrhea cases and have had better luck with it there than in fecal water syndrome. And that's probably because really with diarrhea, we're treating more often an acute and very specific time point, and it's not a long-term feeding plan. We will tube horses with psyllium, and that's a good way to get the slime in there, though you have to get that just right to get it through your pump.
I bet. If anybody has never fed psyllium before, you don't have to wait very long after you've added the water. It just gelatinizes and it's like goop. I made the mistake of doing it, putting it in feed and then getting the feed wet and sort of walked away for 5 minutes and came back and went, oh, wow, that's like jelly.
Yes.
And a pretty tenacious jelly.
Something that they're probably not going to want to eat because it's like like gel. It was bizarre. So I learned that if I was going to do it, I had to make my feed and get it wet and then sprinkle the psyllium on top dry.
Yes.
and then hand it to them. Like, so the cilium hadn't really got wet. It's really weird stuff.
It is interesting stuff, but you can feed it dry, right? And so,
Yeah.
And that's what, people feed, right, as some of the remedies to rid sand from the
Right.
colon is psyllium, and people typically feed them dry, top dress their
Right.
concentrates with
Yeah,
psyllium.
I did not top dress it. I learned that the hard way. You top dress it, you don't mix it into wet feed.
Learned how. So I think it definitely is on the list, makes the cut of, reliable things to try. Just maybe know the issues with feeding it wet.
Right, for sure. Do you have any luck with pre or probiotics? I mean, we obviously psyllium and the beet pulp we've talked about as being sort of a prebiotic fiber that supports existing, bacteria, whereas a probiotic would be live bacteria that might help repopulate a hindgut. But I'm thinking back to your comment at the beginning that we apparently now understand that there isn't any difference in the microbial population. So I'm just kind of like, maybe it doesn't make any sense to do probiotics. I don't know.
And, probiotics make a lot of sense, maybe a little bit less so in the horse. Or maybe we just have a little bit more to learn. There are a couple of products that have a high number of colony-forming units of Saccharomyces boulardii, which is probably the one that we know the most about to be beneficial in horses. However, there are a million probiotic products with not a lot of control, right, of what's actually in them. And the more we learn about the gut microbiome, I will admit that probably the less intrigued I am by probiotics. Yeah. I don't know that we can make a dent and affect anything with a tube of paste or a little powder.
Certainly, I think most of the things you're going to find on the shelf in your feed store are not, at least the ones I've seen, when you look at the numbers of CFUs, which is colony forming units, they're like 10 million or whatever, and that's not going to do anything. I mean, I think it was Guelph did a study where they showed you probably need about 50 billion CFUs of, live whatever it is to have an effect. And then, to I think what you were hinting at is, it has to make it through the stomach alive. And part of the purpose of the stomach being so acidic is to kill off bacteria that your horse has been picking up, licking things and eating stuff off the ground that shouldn't be in the digestive tract. So how do we know that the bacteria that's in your probiotic is even going to get to the hindgut alive? I mean, there are a couple of the bacillus species, so Bacillus subtilis and Bacillus coagulans that have been shown to be stable in very low pHs. So I sort of lean towards those a little bit. I've only seen coagulans as a supplement. I've seen Bacillus subtilis in feed. So those are things that I'll look for. Like you mentioned, the Saccharomyces cerevisiae or Boulardii are both very good. I'm very curious about mycotoxins. I don't know that they're particularly linked to fecal water syndrome, but I think that we know more about their sort of detrimental effects in ruminants because ruminants are more sensitive to mycotoxins. But there's some interesting work looking at mycotoxins in horses. And for our listeners, mycotoxins are toxic sort of secondary substances that are released by fungi that might be in your horse's environment. So there's going to be mycotoxins in your hay, there's going to be mycotoxins in your feed, and feed companies screen for these things, and they don't, if they have high levels of mycotoxins, hopefully those ingredients are not making it into your horse's feed. But I mean, I've had hay tested for mycotoxins, and interestingly, the alfalfa that I could see mold in tested for basically zero mycotoxins, and the Bermuda that looked pretty nice had mycotoxins, not at a level that was going to be detrimental, but they were in there. So there are mycotoxins in the things your horse is eating. And, they're an interesting thing that I don't think the equine industry has really spent a lot of time focusing on. So I have sort of a curiosity about them. And what they may be doing in the digestive tract and whether they contribute to some of these GI conditions that we see, sort of low-grade stuff that could be anything. And often I think gets attributed to other things than mycotoxins because we just don't think about mycotoxins very much.
You're right. That would be interesting to know more about that.
Yeah, there is not a lot of work being done, I don't think, in horses, but I keep encouraging people, companies that have products that have been shown to be pretty beneficial in other species. I keep trying to encourage them, like, this could very well be a thing in horses. You should do some work into this. So they're starting to listen. So
oh, good.
Yeah, and there's actually now, Alltech actually is a company that they will screen. They can screen for 56 mycotoxins, and so they're the ones that I sent my hay to just out of curiosity. And they're actually there's some development of a stall-side mycotoxin tester that you could actually use to test hay and feed in the field, which I think would be really interesting. So anyway, I keep chatting to them about they should do more in horses, because I think it's it contributes to liver issues. It can cause just unthriftiness, just things that you're just like, the horse isn't right, but you can't put your thumb on anything. It's possible. We just need to know more about it.
Yes.
So the biosponge is another common thing that people try and the vets sometimes recommend. Can you tell us what that is and how it works?
Sure. Biosponge is an adsorbent. So it's earthen materials and minerals, and it has been shown to bind to some bacteria, toxins released by those bacteria, viruses, and really has its place, I think, in equine medicine for sure. I quite like it. I haven't found that it usually by the time I see a horse, they've already tried biosponge typically, and that certainly in an adult horse with fecal water syndrome, I have not found that biosponge is the answer. There may be cases that that I just haven't seen where it did help. But that's something that I use quite a lot in adult horses and certainly foals with diarrhea. For the reason that I mentioned, the mechanism of action, but I don't tend to reach for it with fecal water syndrome.
Mm-hmm. I've certainly seen people try it, and maybe it worked initially, and then it sort of didn't work over a period. It didn't work again, kind of thing. If it came back, or it just came back even while they were on the biosponge, and then I'm always like, then was it the biosponge that really made it go away, or did it just happen to, So I have similar kind of response. But are there any medications you prescribe for fecal water syndrome, or not really?
Pretty rarely. That would be on a individual case basis, and pretty rarely. Again, I do blood work in order to make sure that there's not some systemic effect, at least measurable, inflammatory effect or organ function problem going on. And then really since understanding, I think probably many of us used to use specific antibiotics to try to, adjust the microbiome in the hind gut more so. Before learning this about the microbiome doesn't appear to be the problem.
Right. So let's not screw it up with antibiotics.
Right. I mean, truly. And so in years past, I have, but I have gone away from that now.
Yeah.
And never mind the, sort of, there's a big focus in the world, of course, in the judicious use of antimicrobials because of the resistance development problem. And so that's sort of on my mind. And just as we learn more and more, I think antibiotics probably pretty rarely would have a place in this treatment of this condition.
That's good to know, because sometimes I think people want to reach for a medication, right? So that's why I was kind of curious. But
again, it would be fantastic if this works for everybody. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So for those horses like Jill with the pink leg paints kind of thing and what have you, I mean, I see a lot of people, they're washing off the manure and the fecal water, and I also grew up, seeing a lot of horses getting their legs and things washed in mud, and it nearly always resulted in scratches and sometimes cellulitis. And, you have to be careful not to create a whole different problem. But I mean, should we be washing that fecal water off the horse's legs each day? And if so, are there any good barrier creams or something you can put on the skin to protect it so you don't end up creating a different kind of problem?
That's my opinion on that is, depends very much on what the horse is doing and what sort of hair coat they have. The horse who lives in pasture in winter who has it, I would say trying to keep that, clean daily is probably not really wise. And
Right.
what I've found is oftentimes that horse who lives in pasture, and particularly in wintertime when they have more of a hair coat, the sort of we can be graphic on this podcast, right?
Right.
Yes.
The manure, kind of all that liquid that runs down, kind of cakes onto the long hair, and I rarely actually see skin problems in those horses.
That makes sense.
Because it cakes on, kind of grabs onto the long hairs and clumps up, and it's gross, I suppose, but it's not giving them a skin condition.
That's what I used to see in England with, people would come in and their horses would have mud all over their legs, which they would then wash off, not realizing that the skin was actually dry and the hair
underneath
was doing its job protecting
Correct.
the skin. And then they would power hose it with a hose and force liquid onto the skin. I mean, I had a friend whose horse got very nasty, actually ended up with very nasty cellulitis. It was, bad. Meanwhile, we never washed our horses' legs off when they came in from the muddy pasture and just threw it in the stall and then brushed the mud off the next morning when it was dry. Never had any scratches, never had any issue, any of that. So
that's the same concept. Although any of us who have dealt with these know that there's no brushing off that stuff. Right. The caked on manure, there's no, that's a serious amount of special products to get that off if you don't just let it, come off with the hair as they shed.
Right.
Now, the horses who don't live in the, sort of out in the field lifestyle, I do like to clean them, or horses with short hair coats, or, obviously if they're showing and being ridden, etc. So the trick is to get them clean, but then let them dry before you put anything on their skin, because putting any sort of barrier cream on damp skin is a really bad idea. You're trapping in bacteria and micro bits of manure that are still there, et cetera. And so we try to figure out when is the, longest span of time between poops usually. Clean the horse, dry. So I don't mind, towel dry after they're clean and let them sort of be out and in the sun and in the air to dry. And then the types of barrier creams that I've had the best luck with are actually more sort of diaper cream types of things. Mm-hmm. And they all have ridiculous names, right?
Like butt paste.
What are butt paste? I mean, they're all something monkey. There's something with monkey in the description, right?
Yeah.
And they're all sort of a zinc oxide based, product.
Yeah.
And people have used Vaseline for sure. The diaper rash products are the ones that I've actually found to be the most effective and sort of last the longest. Mm-hmm. And then, sort of a pretty easy to then a wipe off or a light hose. But usually there's still kind of a layer on, so they can just add a little bit more on top of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I'm just going to add.
I'm sure there are other answers.
I was just going to add from experience,
yes.
No veterinary knowledge to this at all. If you're just starting this journey, pick a horse shampoo that is for sensitive skin, because you are going to be washing a lot. I like to use Orvis, which is I think they sell it for white horses, but it's actually to wash wool clothes. And so it's a really light, sensitive shampoo. And it comes in a tub that you put your hand in, so you can actually get it on your fingers and work it into that. But you are going to be washing a lot, maybe multiple times a day. So don't get something that's really fragrant. Don't use your most expensive show shampoo. Find something that's good for sensitive skin, because you're going to be doing a lot of washing.
Yeah, that's a good idea. And I have a little hack for diaper cream that I found, and it's an N of 1, so you can take it for what it's worth. But when my daughter's pony started rubbing his tail out in the summer, and he would shampoo it and get it all clean and clean his sheath and all the things that are supposed to cause tail rubbing, dewormed in, did all the things. I found that if I put diaper rash cream really up between his butt cheeks, he's kind of a stock pony, so he's got those nice big thick, chunky thighs. And in the summer here, it's so hot that I think there's a lot of sweat and friction and dirt that gets up between his butt cheeks. And when I put diaper rash cream way up there as far as you could between his butt cheeks, he stopped rubbing his tail.
That's awesome. Can we do a podcast on like hacks like that?
Absolutely.
I share that because it was such an easy thing. And afterwards I was like,
it's awesome.
It makes total sense. I mean, the poor guy, like he's literally, his thighs are rubbing together. It's 110 degrees outside. Right. There's probably like sand and shaving.
Crystallized sweat and sand.
You put your hand up there and it's gritty feeling even if you do wash it out frequently. So anyway, that's your friend, as well. So.
And you will get that chafing. I mean, at least, again, I have pink skin pony. I mean, I live in a hot, humid climate. And so he was getting pretty raw. And the diaper cream was the best thing that I found to put on it. And you have to put it on multiple times a day, especially with the humidity, because it drips a bit and gets kind of gross. But it is a quick relief for them if you are starting to see some chapped skin.
That's interesting that it sort of runs in humidity. I actually, being in California, is not something we really experience, right?
Right.
So it'll stay on for weeks here, right? It just makes sort of a cake.
Yeah,
I can see how it would run in heat and humidity,
Yeah. So if my horse has free fecal water, but they're healthy and happy, can we just go on and not treat it, or is it going to turn into something more serious?
You can do whatever you want. However,
it's your horse. No,
I recommend, right? For the longest time, we sort of said like it's sort of not a big deal, but I think many of us have witnessed, and owners do too. Well, let me answer the first part. I have not seen, nor am I aware of any literature that shows progression of it into something, into a more involved GI disturbance. So I again don't think that that's likely to happen. However, many of the horses, not all, but you actually do see some discomfort when they're passing the manure, like as it's coming down the pipe or during the passing. They're tail swishing, they might be stomping their hind legs, that sort of thing. Some horses with this condition are just get a little bit of bloating, a little bit of gas distension. Again, that's part of why I like to sort of work them up more than just say, yes, that's what you have, and just understand sort of what type they have. So I guess I think it's worth trying the things because I think the quality of life is affected probably to varying degrees, horse to horse. Even the ones who seem, like they're fine. I do think it's worth trying because at some level it has to be, if nothing else, irritating, annoying to them. So from sort of quality of life standpoint, I would say, yes, it's worth trying.
Keep trying.
And it's not usually expensive things, right? Because we're not talking about medication. We're usually talking about feed change management being the primary. It's not a wildly expensive. It just requires that sort of time and dedication.
Yeah. So I think it was in 2018, I was at AAEP, which is a big equine vet conference, and there was a tabletop session on fecal water syndrome. It was standing room only, like literally. I mean, people, it was like out the door. And so clearly, to me, it indicated this is an issue that a lot of veterinary practices are having to deal with. And thinking of that session, brings up a couple of things for me. The first is, I feel like I see more of these cases now than I did when I started doing nutrition consulting 15 years ago. I don't know whether you see more now than you used to, or maybe owners are just bringing it up more. I don't know. But do you think we are seeing an increase in it in our horse population?
So it's such a great question. I really don't know the answer. Maybe it would be great to poll a large number of veterinarians to find that out. and many times the primary veterinarian, or so the general practitioner, is going to be the first line oftentimes. Right. And so as an internist, I would say I probably see the same number that I've always seen, roughly,
right.
Roughly speaking, but I tend to see the frustrating cases, right? And so it would be a great question to pose, I think, to a smattering of general practitioners to see if
Don't we know somebody
prevalent.
that's associated with AAEP that could maybe put that out?
Oh, what's her name again?
Yeah, what's her name? Couldn't she do a survey amongst veterinarians and maybe we could get some data around that?
But it's interesting because I think if it is more prevalent, of course, then my mind goes, well, why?
Yeah, sure.
Sure. Would that help us understand what's causing it more? I don't know. But the second point that I took away from that session was the other thing they were talking about was there was a very active conversation about doing fecal transplants, and a good number of practitioners reported that they were having good luck with that. Although since we've had our conversation, I'm kind of curious now as if it's not really an effect of a changed microbiome, why doing a fecal transplant would help. But it's something that people do sometimes for, disrupt, whether it's fecal water syndrome or loose manure, diarrhea type things. Could you explain what that is for people that are curious?
Sure. Again, this is the graphic version, right, of the podcast.
Right. And as the tea drinker, out of the I do like making tea. So
yes, it is. It is very much a tea or a liqueur. A fecal transfaunation is utilizing fecal matter from another, in this case, horse, who really should be residing on the same farm, we know, and giving it to another horse, right? With the idea that a healthy horse with normal manure will have a healthy, normal ratio of different bacteria, and we can give those to the horse that needs help with their GI. There are a handful of issues with that, and we've touched on them, but sort of bringing them together, the acidity of the stomach proves problematic for just putting them in. So really, you would need to suppress stomach acid for a handful of days before putting in bacteria-filled fecal matter and hoping that it makes it to the back end where you want it. But fecal transfaunation absolutely has its place in equine medicine, and I use it on occasion. It's not just a one-time mix it up and tube it to a horse to actually have effect.
Yeah, there are protocols, right? You have to do it several times, several days apart. It's quite involved. Your vet's going to be visiting you several times, and so
precisely. And then managing the pH of the stomach. It does have its place, but it's not a quick little thing. The responsible way to do it also is to ensure that the donor horse, if you will, that they are free of a whole list of potential pathogens. So you test them, a handful of times to make sure. So it's a process, and it's absolutely utilized. It is interesting, as you said, because the microbiome is not drastically different, like not significantly different in affected and unaffected horses. What is it? Because what people see is what they see, right? And they are seeing an improvement in some cases. I think the one study anyway looked at it, and it was between 30 and 40% of horses showed improvement. So if it's, there was one that actually looked at the microbiome before and after fecal transfaunation in these cases, and it didn't really change all that much. Like there was not a significant statistical difference in the microbiome before and after receiving fecal transfaunation. So then that begs the question, maybe it's not the microbiomes, but some of the other constituents or some of
maybe
the things.
It's the butyric acid or something that's in the feces that's
something
so
that the bacteria have produced that's free in the tea. And it's not the actual bugs. So maybe we don't actually need live bacteria. Maybe that's not what does the thing. So a percentage of horses will respond to that. I will say that I usually reserve that for the horses that haven't responded to other things. That's been my way of doing things.
Right.
Um,
So much to learn still. It's exciting. So much we don't understand. Frustrating on the one hand, but kind of exciting. The science part of mine is kind of, it's like, ooh, we've still got so many things we don't understand.
There's so many projects. Yes.
Yeah.
Given that prevention is always better than having to treat or cure something, what advice do you have for listeners for trying to prevent the development of fecal water?
It's a tough one in this scenario. Because a lot of times it's, it's not something that was directly done. The one thing I would say is something that we all know, trying to avoid abrupt changes in diet, trying to do that gradual change to allow for accommodation by the horse for the colon to sort of adapt. And then the only other piece really isn't preventive entirely, but it just want to repeat the not letting it go on for more than a short number of weeks before contacting your veterinarian for evaluation and advice, because I do think they're harder to help the longer they go. But many times it begins, sometimes there's not something that we can identify what set it off, so it's really hard to know how to prevent it.
I think, and at the time when mine happened, like I had just moved to Iowa, we went through I did all the steps, every one of them, eliminating everything, starting again. I had brought a load of hay with me from Colorado, enough to feed for a few months, and looking back now that I'm, 2.5 years or 3 years out from it, my horse is allergic to Iowa. Like there's some things that are not within your control. It just happened to be the perfect storm that we moved. Had we have moved to Arizona, maybe it wouldn't have happened, but you may not get an answer, or it may not be within your control of what actually happened. So I would say also don't beat yourself up, because it is a bit exhausting when you're in it. Just like, what is going wrong and is this ever going to change? So, go through the steps, take the time, but it's definitely a struggle and it's definitely a challenge for anybody that has to deal with it, especially if it goes on for weeks, months, seasonally, whatever the case is.
Right.
This has been a great discussion and a topic that a lot of horse owners struggle with, and hopefully our listeners now have a better understanding of what is going on and when horses have this condition and how to manage it. Before we go, is there anything else that you'd like to share that we didn't cover?
I'll just touch on a couple of things. And one is that psychological and or physiological stress are at least proposed to be factors in the development of fecal water. That's obviously much harder to objectively quantify, but I believe it was in that owner survey, horses were more likely, sort of slightly more likely, to be the underdog, the low man on the totem pole in group settings. And of course, not all of our horses are housed together, but those who are, they were slightly more likely to be lower on the pecking order. So that's sort of an interesting thing. In California, it is less common to have horses all together, and so that's a little bit less something that we focus on here, but something just to consider. Goodness, if rearranging the herd a little bit fixed it, wouldn't that be nice?
And probably would make your horse feel a little happier about life in general if he's, if the cause is he's low man on the totem pole, he might be, maybe he's just not generally happy in his day-to-day social
stress
structure.
Is affecting him. And then the one other thing that I just wanted to touch on is, particularly for those horses that we put on a high percentage of a pelleted ration in order to get control of the manure, I usually tell people if it's quite possible that we'll be able to eke back toward a more normal diet in the future. You're not stuck with feeding a large percentage of the diet in pelleted hay forever, that you're trying to, tote all these bags to shows. And
Right.
is that something that you found as well, Clara,
Yeah,
that once you get
absolutely.
out
Yeah.
far enough, and that's anybody's guess when we all feel comfortable, and then add 30 more
Right.
days, and then
Right.
maybe slowly start adding back in, and trying to find that kind of happy spot,
And I
where
go
the horse is.
down slowly too, partly because for all the right reasons, people can be a little resistant to switching to pellets.
Of course.
Because they're concerned about ulcers and all the boredom and all
Yeah,
the other
fair
things.
enough.
And I totally
Yep.
get that. Or, let's be honest, their barn is paying, for their hay and their board, it's covered. And if they're going to do pellets, they've got to go buy their own,
Yep.
and so it's an extra expense. So sometimes I'll start off with, well, let's just do 25% of their daily forage as pellets for a couple of weeks and see where that gets us. And if it gets us nowhere, then we're going to do 50%,
Yeah.
and sort of we kind of work our way down and have the exact same conversation where I say, and once we hopefully figure this out and it goes away, then we'll gradually come back up again, But again, I come up in sort of increments just to make sure that we don't just sort of end up back where we started.
And isn't that interesting that you could potentially resume, the same forage diet, or nearly the same
Yeah.
forage diet, and not have it come back? I mean, just in
Yeah.
terms of
I mean,
if you look
I
at,
know, it doesn't
what's
make
the
any
cause
sense.
again, right?
Right, I
Right.
know. It's just, it's muffling. And it's funny for you, I was sitting here, thinking about like when I listen to people on, often I'm working with these people remotely and they're sharing their stories with me and I just, I'm over the phone and I'm taking notes and listening and, like you, it sounds like I have sort of 3 or 4 things I might try. And the thing that I recommend to one client that we start with is different from what I recommend to somebody else to start with. And it's often based purely on the history they've shared, and no pun intended, but like a gut feeling I have about what I think is going to maybe work for this horse based on the history they've shared and what they're feeding and how they manage it and where they are. And it's just sort of interesting as sometimes,
Mm-hmm.
I'm
It's
motivated
not the same for
it's not
everyone.
always the same for everyone. And I
Right.
don't know that I have
Right.
a necessarily like truly scientific reason why I pick one product to try with one horse. It is just like sometimes I'm just like, for some reason I have this feeling that we're going to try this product with this horse, or you've tried all the products, but what you haven't tried is pelleted hay. So we're just going to jump straight to that kind of thing. It's sort of.
And I think the history is probably the history, and then the exam that I do really helps me sort of know where to start. Yeah. So back to Jill's taking notes,
Yeah.
right? Because that's super helpful.
And I want to say to people, because I experience this with owners when I'm taking their history, people are just like rattling off these, stories and the history. And I'm like, hang on, whoa. So hang on. So this happened and then you did, and I want more detail about something because they'll share something that to them seems inconsequential that I'm like, oh, hang on a minute. Tell me more about that.
Mm-hmm.
Because that might be something. And sometimes I can hear a little sort of, not frustration, but I guess for want of a better word, frustration in their voice that it's like, I'm asking them to tell me more, and I want more details. And maybe I come across as I'm sort of being demanding or something, that I want them to tell me everything. But it's like, I really, if your veterinarian's doing that, it's because they really are trying to help. They want the full picture. They want every piece of detail. And they're not just being difficult. They're trying to.
They're not judging, right?
No, exactly. I think that's some of it too.
Yeah.
That's a good point. I think sometimes people can feel like a little judge if somebody says, "Well, why did you do that?" Or what? I always say, "But what motivated you to start that supplement?" Or what motivated you to, whatever. And it's like, because in the moment there was a reason why they started doing something,
and you want to know what that is. Your curiosity has been piqued there, and you were kind of digging in on. Same.
Yeah, it's like tell me what motivated. What was going on there?
Here.
That why? I mean, like say, you've got a hoof supplement in there. What motivated you to add that hoof supplement? And oftentimes it's not uncommon for people to say, "Oh, I don't really know. I just felt like." But then sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's like, well, he had a really bad quarter crack back then, so I started the hoof or whatever it was. But it's like, tell me more about why you. When I deal with these people that literally have 9-10 supplements in their diets, and I'm like, okay, so why do we have these things, and why are they still in there? Well, is it doing anything? No, it never really did anything. I just kept it in there. It just, I'm like, okay, then we can probably get rid of it then.
And then it's a discussion
whatever.
of if they're in this syndrome, right? If they're going to be added back in, then they're done so thoughtfully.
Right. One
Right.
at a
If we're going to
time, so
start
you
one at
can
a time,
see.
and does your horse still need this?
Right,
Right.
exactly. Right.
I like that is something that I do really try to do is, in these cases, limiting the number of ingredients. That's just my own way of, it's one way for me to sort of understand what works and what doesn't work.
Exactly.
But I also think there has to be some value in it as we're trying to sort of quiet down this colon and make it happier, not throwing too much at it.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for joining us again today. It's always a pleasure, and we truly appreciate your time.
I always enjoy it, and I'm sorry that we have so many unanswered questions on this particular topic. Hopefully, as time progresses, there will be more. I'm confident that some of the questions that we just don't have answers to now, that the work that's currently being done, we will have answers for in the not too distant future.
I'm sure we will. There's so much work being done on the hindgut and understanding the hindgut and how it functions.
And the whole
sure
microbiome and stress and the, gut-brain microbiome axis. And it's really pretty fascinating stuff.
Yeah, it is. Well, I'm sure we'll find a way to get you back on again in the future. There'll be another topic that we're reaching.
All right. Oh, and we got to do the hacks one. Actually, we probably need your listeners to write in with their hacks. That's probably the way to go.
Yeah,
that's a good idea.
We should definitely do a hacks one. That would be good.
Okay, we'll put you down for hacks.
I want to hear them. I want to learn.
All right. Thanks so much.
My pleasure. Take care.
For our listeners, if you'd like to be a part of our conversation, please send your suggestions for future topics and equine nutrition questions to info@scoopandscale.com and is spelled out. You can also find Claire at clarityequine.com.
We know that if you're like us, you're probably listening to this while driving or doing barn chores. But when your hands are free, if you'd share it with your friends on social media and be sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast platform, it helps other horse lovers like you to find us.
For the Scoop and Scale podcast, I'm Jill Jackson.
And I'm Dr. Claire Tunis.
Thanks for riding along with us.